Hey everybody, this is Jen Kleinhens.
And I'm Rob Vose.
And you're listening to another episode of Everybody Hates Your Brand, a podcast where we talk about our thoughts and opinions on marketing, from customer experience to brand and everything in between. Join us today as we talk to Mark Bainbridge, co-founder of Dragonfly AI.
So as with other interviews that we've done, we had some technical issues that meant only one of us could interview Mark, sadly. And in this case, the person in the spotlight was Jennifer, because Jen has most background with Mark and has worked with the Dragonfly app before. So without further ado, we'll lead you straight into that interview.
So welcome, Mark, to the podcast. Obviously, the very first question we ask all of our guests, and you as well, is if you just want to go ahead and give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and to the Dragonfly tool.
Sure. Well, thank you both for having me on the podcast today. Brilliant to be here. My name is Mark Bainbridge. I'm one of the co-founders of Dragonfly AI, a visual artificial intelligence product, which basically helps us to see what the human brain sees first when we're looking at any content. My track record spans almost 2 centuries now, I think. But now I've been in business for over 30 years, and I've done sort of, senior brand jobs, and I've worked in creative technology. And now I've decided to focus on this rather exciting ride that we're on with Dragonfly.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about the history of Dragonfly? Because just full disclosure, I've worked with you guys in the past in different roles, and I always think the history of the tool is always so interesting.
So it actually started, I think, way back in 2010 as a piece of academic research at Queen Mary University in London. And they were setting out originally to try to give robotic devices human interpretation skills so they could sort of navigate more effectively around the context they were operating in. And it kind of kicked off about 4 years of fairly deep academic study into what we call System 1 human brain function. So if I may, I just kind of make the distinction. I'm sure most people will know this anyway, but System 1 is the kind of biological function of the brain, and System 2 is our kind of top-down processing, our learned behaviors, so the things that make us distinct and different. The biological functions typically are a lot more universal, so that's where Dragonfly sort of operates in that context.
Yeah, the thing I always really liked about it is because it sort of skips that internal filter that people have when you ask them a question. So if you do sort of a focus group and say like, hey, what did you notice in this poster? Everything anyone's saying is, whether they know it or not, is kind of going through that internal filter. But Dragonfly kind of skips that whole filtration process and goes kind of straight to what people's brains are seeing.
Exactly. And it shows us instantaneously what the human brain is seeing. And because of its universality, it shows us what humankind sees. So it's a very, very powerful tool. And interestingly, the research established that the brain uses 5 principal neural pathways in this initial process of sort of understanding what we're looking at. So if I just briefly cover those, it's sort of light and darkness, it's texture, it's contrast and edges, it's shape, perspective, and orientation, which is our ability to decipher patterns very, very effectively. And we use it continuously. And the reason we use it, because if we try to kind of take in and understand all the content we saw, we wouldn't be able to cope with the processing that demands the brain to undertake. So basically, it's a kind of filtration process, but it's a biological one, and it's subconscious. We're not even thinking about doing it. It's happening all the time that we're making our way through the world.
Yeah. This is kind of off topic, but I wonder if people's attention spans or like their ability to have things catch their eye has sort of gotten worse or gotten better, just kind of based on the environment that we're living in now. It feels like there's so much stimulus everywhere.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I suspect that we are evolving to become what I'd say more media savvy. We're better at reading. We're cleverer. We've learned about stuff. So actually, the whole principle of using content to push ideas and propositions in front of consumers, it gets harder as we get clever about what we're interested in and what we decide not to take notice of.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'd like to, this is all like, I could talk about Dragonfly as a tool all day, and we'll talk some more about it, obviously. But I would love to just kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about, your history and kind of, the fact that in the past, it seems like you've been as a marketer at more established companies. So like, what was that like going into a very early stage startup? So like, why did you decide to kind of take that plunge with Dragonfly?
I guess, to be completely honest, it was because having done sort of, I mean, I think always really interesting jobs. I mean, that for me is one of my primary motivations. You've got to work with people you like, and you've got to work on things that you genuinely believe in. Otherwise, it's a hard slog. So if I cast back to the earliest part of my career, I mean, I was a marketing director for an expedition charity. The reason I did that was because I got to travel to some of the most incredible places on the planet. And from there, I then went to work for the army as ultimately as CMO. Into banking, to earn my stripes in that world. And at the end of it, I think you kind of take a step back and think, all this is just so ultimately formulaic. It's like it doesn't require genius intelligence. Whereas if you move into the world of startup, you have to think about absolutely every dimension of a business. It's exciting. I mean, it's filled with risk. But when you get very used to the tramlines of a corporate organization, it can be incredibly refreshing and reinvigorating. Actually, gets you energized every day. So I know that I have to go to work and give the best I can, in Dragonfly's world, because it needs it. It needs us to be, that committed to it. We've got to believe in the product, which I think we all do. We genuinely believe it's a kind of scientific tool that will make a fundamental difference to how marketing is executed over time. But it's also, hugely exciting. We've been through funding rounds. We've been hiring people. We've been pitching endlessly. I mean, I just know we probably pitch at least twice a day, every day of the week,
Oh,
and
wow.
we have done since sort of March. I mean, evangelism is an important part of what we do. But it's very exciting. I love it. And for my kind of 2 golden rules is a product I believe in absolutely, and people I think I want to spend my time working with. And we have got some phenomenal people in our business. So we're very, very lucky.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I have to totally agree with you. It's hard being in a job where you don't like what you do, or you don't like the product, or you don't like the people you work with. It's funny because a job is always a job, right? But that's a hard
Yeah.
slog. I've done that a few times.
I did it once. I think I probably I made a mistake and went to a business that was probably not the right fit for me. And I weathered it for a couple of years because I felt it was important not to have a little a career blip basically. But
Right.
it was a loathsome task, frankly. And you just know that they're not getting the best of you because you just don't feel the energy, the passion. It's
Yeah,
a really
it's not
important
fair
part of
for anybody, really.
it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, did anything kind of surprise you about startup life? Like, or is it something that like you had in the back of your mind, and it was exactly like that? Like, what was, the surprises you kind of learned along the way?
So it's the difference. So I'd done quite a lot of advisory work, with startup businesses, as a consultant in between previous roles. So I knew quite a lot what to expect, and obviously I've worked, within big businesses and run, big budgets and all the rest of it. But the things you don't anticipate are the fact that you're going to be living on fumes for quite a long time. I mean, I love this notion of people who believe they can go out and they can fundraise for a conceptual idea. You just got to wise up the fact that's just not a reality anymore. You have to work extraordinarily hard. And in some instances, we took compression during the first lockdowns to make sure that we could make it through them. So it comes with all sorts of pressures, and of course those spill into your personal family life, because that means other things can't happen. So you have to have a very supportive environment you're working in. So my wife and daughters have been brilliant, but you also have to believe in it. You have to every day get up and believe that you can make this thing happen. I think the choice of people. So I've had a couple of false starts in startup before. One was very much based on completely the wrong set of people I was working with, and the dynamic was dreadful. And you should recognize that if you're going to do this, do it with people you trust. Understand that it's going to take way longer than you could begin to anticipate. I mean, literally, it could be as long as 2 years before you start seeing anything like a kind of, like a kind of salary. And you've got to dig deep to find the kind of the commitment to what you're doing, I think, to do that. And because you've got to get in front of people all the time, they're all potential investors, they're all potential customers, they're all potential users of the product, everybody you speak to. But at the same time, you have to maintain a degree of sanity. You've got to, get out, enjoy the fresh air, take a break from things, not become welded to your laptop. And I think that's, in the current circumstances, obviously that gets harder and harder at the moment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you're making too, because I think like self-management is such a big part of working in a startup or being an entrepreneur. It's the ability to say like, yes, I have to wear many hats, and yes, I'm going to have to work probably harder than I've ever worked before, but the ability to shut off, I think, is like the long-term way that you do keep your sanity, right?
Yeah, I think so, and it is a really important balance in life. That you and I've always felt that kind of work-life balance is critical. Find a job that you're really passionate about, throw as much of your time into it as you can, but don't forget to enjoy the rest of your life whilst you do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's very easy to get consumed with passion about certain things. And I think there is that kind of fine line between feeling really committed and really motivated and really passionate about something, and just mindless optimism.
Oh,
So
very true.
yeah, that ultimately becomes very important. We used to describe ourselves more as a grown up than a startup because basically we're all a bit old. But then I kind of reassure myself that quite a lot of the bigger and more successful businesses that are in existence were formed by people who started them when they were in their 50s. So I have no difficulty with that. And what I love about it is our interns are these fantastic, dynamic young people coming out of education with phenomenal grasp of technologies and applications. And then you've got people like myself who we've done the 30-year stint working through big corporate organizations, running big brands, running big budgets, and I think what I love most is that we try to kind of keep it very level. So it's not about telling people what to do, it's about trying to get the very best out of our people. So I think for me, the investment we make in our people, their well-being, is a really vital part of it. And as soon as you start getting into that kind of domain, you're thinking about business structures, you're thinking about options plans, you're thinking about their security, getting the best from them. What do they need to flourish? So there is a kind of a moment that you don't really recognize because it doesn't kind of come out of you and sort of hold a sign up saying it's time to grow up. But there's definitely a point at which you realize that this is more significant than it was when you started. Sometimes it's when you take in a bit of investment, suddenly you've got responsibilities to shareholders. I mean, these days the amount of contract and what comes with that contract can be really frightening. And if you weren't of a reasonable level of steel, you might not want to sign up to some of the deals that are offered, because it requires personal liabilities to be taken on. They really don't want to risk their cash, so they want assurances from you, and you have to sign up to all sorts of stuff. Anyway, we're at that point now where I think we're in the the BAU part of what we do is consolidating. I mean, a year ago it was the innovation. Now it becomes the business as usual. The next step up for us will be the refinement of what we do. Looking at the new augmentations of the product service business. The way that we approach things, who we're targeting. And we still want to innovate because it's really important, but we have to kind of now balance that desire to create genuine creative innovation continuously with we've got to build a baseline that's consolidated, stable, and fluid. We've got people who we're responsible for. We want this to be phenomenally exciting as well, because it is. I mean, you've seen the product, Jen. You know what it's all about. It gives you a completely fresh look at stuff. And so we need to make sure that we can build the business progressively, whether that's looking at new regions or whether it's looking at shifting from, say, a subscription model to an enterprise model, or whether it's moving outside of, our kind of FMCG retail focus to other sectors. The opportunity for us is really exciting. like all businesses, ultimately, we need to kind of create more than just the product in terms of value. We need a lot of people say to us that it's fantastic. Is there a magic button that tells me what to do? And the answer is not yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, can I ask this then? I'm interested, kind of going through that process of deciding kind of what the product is going to be, but backtracking a little bit when you're first kind of out there getting those first few customers, like what did you learn about how to market and maybe not market the product? And the reason I ask is because I do, I really believe in the product. I've used it for, a few years now. And I think it's so simple, but I think sometimes the what it's doing, like the scientific side of things, can be hard for people if they don't have an understanding. So, when we were introducing it to clients, it was very much a process of like, okay, you know, yes, what it does is really cool, and you can see it right away, and you get it right away, and that's really great. But getting them kind of a little bit on the journey, like the story before you get to the product of how people see things, what they notice, how much attention people have, the fact that the sometimes hard truth, I think, for marketers, that that piece of communication you spent 6 months polishing and went back and forth with legal about, actually people will look at it for 0.3 seconds if they look at it at
Yeah.
all. So it's really important that we use something like Dragonfly to make sure that all your work doesn't go to waste. So in terms of kind of marketing the product, like how did you guys come to the point where you would refine the story, and kind of what channels were successful for you in the beginning?
So we tried lots of things to start with. I can remember actually with my co-founder David, we were sitting in a room in Waterloo back in January of 2019, it must have been. And, we brought together as many senior friends and colleagues as we could, really just to tell them what we were up to. We showed them the product at the time. It was just the iOS application, so it was very simple. And our first sort of approach was thinking, well, what can we do that's relatively straightforward, because we've got no money, so we can't kind of launch into a massive marketing campaign. So we started by building effectively a network of associates who could help us to evangelize. That went quite well. I mean, it worked in different ways, and people dipped in and dipped out. Some stayed with us for longer, some for shorter. We recognized absolutely the value of things like LinkedIn. It's probably been the most important tool for us, but more important than networks and associates was the story to tell. Dragonfly has a wonderful story, that that backstory of where it came from, a academic science background, our first kind of client explorations, how we then iterated it. We laugh sometimes on our management teams. We said, okay, so the aim today is we've got to think about, in 3 years' time when we're uber successful, being a little bit optimistic, but in 3 years' time when we're uber successful, who's going to play you in the movie? So our current task is we've all got to decide who we want to play us. So somebody said Johnny Depp, which I think is pushing it a little bit, but who knows? That wasn't for me, by the way.
That's an interesting exercise. That's probably a
Yeah,
good interview question. Who would play you in the movie of your life?
absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
But yeah, no, you've got to have a good story to tell. You've got
yeah.
to tell it well. You've got to tell it with a bit of passion and enthusiasm. Make it feel like a bit of a secret that you're revealing. And I think ultimately, at the beginning stage for any startup, people buy from people. They've got to believe in you as much as they have in the product, and that goes for investors as well. They've got to believe in the team that are delivering this thing, not just what the product does. So, you have to be compelling. You have to know it inside out, and you need to be able to to bring it to life for them. The nice thing about it is because it's visual. You do the preamble, then you show it, and typically, the person you're talking to, it's their imagination that helps you to embed it into their business.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting too that you mentioned not only the story, which clearly is very important, and I think that's probably a lesson for everybody in every job, no matter if you're in a startup with a product or or a leader in an organization, is taking the time to think about how you're going to articulate the story,
Mm-hmm.
how you're going to bring it to life. I mean, no matter what it is, if it's creative work or a product or strategic direction. It's interesting. I don't know if you've seen this product masterclass. They advertise it everywhere, and it's basically like very like famous people, CEOs who come in and they give a masterclass on what it is that they do. And I was watching the Bob Iger, so Bob Iger, Disney, famously, and interestingly, that was a whole lesson from him. the same thing. Like how you have to polish the story, you have to do it. And I just hear it kind of coming through from you as well, as like taking that little bit of time to make sure that the narrative that you're sort of spinning out there is the right one.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the way that the business in future will talk about what it does will change. I think
Mm-hmm.
we're currently investigating a ton of stuff about inbound marketing, so making sure we're easy to find, we're intuitive, we're in amongst conversations that are taking place in our sort of sector, because we're quite
Sure.
disruptive. It's not something people will necessarily go out and look for, so
Mm-hmm.
we have to kind of almost sort of shake the tree to get some apples falling from it. But yeah, I do think stories are important, and always in my career, kind of casting back, I think I've had to tell a story to my management team to give them a sense of confidence and belief that what I'm about to do is worth backing. Then once you've kind of won almost that license to do what you're going to do, is you've then got to go out and do it, and you've got to do it brilliantly well so that they believe in you and want to do it next time, but also that you're delivering what you need to in terms of their objectives. So, you've got the understanding of the consumer right. You've pitched your proposition in the right way, but you've made it interesting. And I think the worst thing in the world is when you see a really fantastic idea just being badly talked about, because you
Right.
should think no one's ever going to buy that because it's just not being brought to life right. You've got to be able to bring a bit of that passion we've talked about into the sale, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's something that you guys do really, really well. And it's interesting too, because, for what is essentially like a B2B product. I mean, I don't know what the future hold necessarily for, Dragonfly as a service or a product, that might be customer facing or not business facing, let's put it that way. But many times I've seen startups in the B2B space, like really that's very much out of their depth is the story part of it. It's the molding the story. It's the whole approach, because I think so often with startups, I guess the sort of sexy way to go is B2C. And
Mm,
and that's something that they're very, you can get B2C marketers in and they're very polished and they understand really well like how to tell that story, but it's not always true of kind of B2B startups or marketers or whatever. It's just a different world, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
I
totally.
think the way that you guys have put together the narrative, I think it makes so much sense. When you kind of go in and tell that story about Dragonfly, like what are common objections that you get? Like what are clients or big companies saying? Like, we love this is clearly amazing, but maybe is not for us because why? Like what are some of those things they come back to you with?
So it's an interesting one. There's a couple of ways of answering that. Firstly, from creatives, sometimes
Mm.
you see them. You can read them when you're physically with them. Not so easy these days, but you get a sense from creatives. They'll either see it and go, "Wow, yeah, okay, I get this. This is super smart. It's going to help me to validate my thinking. It might give me a little bit of extra sizzle that I might have missed. I like it." And then you get the creatives that think, "This is trying to do my job for me. It might actually be better than me at what it does." You know,
Oh gosh.
and they get and so we have to be very careful when we're talking to creative people. We always talk about it. It's an augmentation to your creative genius. It's there to help you to validate what you're doing is right. It's brilliant for things like pitch creative. So if you're pitching 3 ideas and you know that one is the one you want to make, you can use Dragonfly to help to prove that it's the right one, because it takes all that bias out of the conversations. So
Hmm.
there's definitely objections sometimes from creatives. We tend to overcome them fairly well, but when you've got very, very old school creatives, and it's less frequent these days, because I think a lot of creatives are very savvy to
Hmm.
both predictive analytic tools and a very grown up digital landscape they're working in. But you do come across it from time to time. I suppose other objections. I mean, there are other tools out there that do things a bit like us, but they do them very, very differently. And our view is that they're just so imprecise. They've kind of taken the old version of, say, eye tracking and panel research and kind of
Hmm.
automated it. Whereas what we do is we've actually taken the formula that the brain uses. So it's incredibly precise and accurate,
Hmm.
what we produce. And we're 2% off human interpretation levels. So we've had that independently validated by MIT. So, I think, there's always somebody says, well, I've got something that does heat mapping. And by doing that, they immediately tell us that they've completely missed the point of what Dragonfly is about. It's not
Yeah.
just about heat mapping. It's an iterative tool that helps you to, create design excellence prior to, publishing your content anywhere. whereas everything else is principally looking at, it compares it to a battery of stuff that's a bit like what you've done. So because this stuff worked a bit like that, then yours will probably work a bit like these. So, there's the difference between unique, precise, and bespoke for each piece of content you look at with Dragonfly versus, comparison of lookup services. And I suppose the other probably ultimately the biggest challenge we might face is that people aren't looking for it. They don't know that it's there. It's not intuitively something. Oh, I wonder if I can find something that shows me what consumers might be thinking about. We're kind of disrupting the market. We're kind of shaking the ground a bit to help to divert people's attention. And when we've got their attention, we have to make sure we use that split moment of time really effectively, to engage and to show what it can do. So the nice thing is, the lean-in moment for us comes in quite fast with most of the people we talk to. I can honestly say, I think out of all of the pitches and presentations I've done, I think I can recall 2 where people were just like, no, I don't think it's quite right for us. And there wasn't really a good valid justification. I just thought, fine, that's okay. Not everybody's going to want to buy this. It's cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think it's a tool that, once you see it, you're like, oh, where has this been all my life? But you wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't prompt something in your brain to go like, oh, you know what I really need? I need a salience tool.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we kind of, so I touched on, we want to define our story. We've had an independent consultant working with us on the branding piece, and she said, what you've done in branding in the first couple of years is superb, which a lot of startups fail to recognize the importance of brand, but they do all the stuff around inbound. So their search optimization is brilliant. And we've got a lot of work to do in that space. But then also we're trying to create, outbound interest. And it's a really interesting time for marketing generally because, the world is a sensitive place at the moment for all sorts of reasons. And I think, the marketer has to be exceptionally careful about how they use language when they're unpacking their stories because, people are having extraordinarily hard times with it. And, and I've always been a believer that the hand of the marketer, the minute it's seen in the shot, you've lost the audience. So you have to kind of understand the context you're operating in, deliver the story in a way that's compelling, and don't shout at people. You want to have a conversation. It's all about that kind of one-to-one rather than one-to-many, ultimately.
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of the reason why I just love Dragonfly so much. And what's interesting, actually, you talk about like kind of brand and the product and everything. I mean, obviously, it's an AI tool, and AI or artificial intelligence, machine learning, like all of these things are kind of buzzwords. I feel like in marketing over the past few years. Do you think that using the term AI, like, does that help you? Does it hinder? Does it turn people off, or do they think like, oh yes, this is something I need because AI is here to help me? Like, are there objections from marketers or creatives around, or reactions, maybe I should say, around that?
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. And as I've mentioned, we did these kind of global feature hacks. The typically, you would hear the buzzwords all the time. You'd hear blockchain, you'd hear big data, you'd hear artificial intelligence, and they're meaningless terms. Describe blockchain to me. In fact, I met a Ukrainian developer who did actually manage to explain blockchain in 2 sentences. I'm not going to be able to repeat it because I think I've forgotten most of it now, but she absolutely nailed it. She was asked by the Prime Minister of Dubai in a meeting we're in, can you tell me what blockchain is really? And she did it. And I thought, wow, that's pretty awesome. AI is basically, replicating our intelligence. So an artificial version of it, which is exactly what Dragonfly does. So we believe artificial intelligence is the right part of our defining brand. So Dragonfly AI, that we think that's absolutely right. But it's not being flippant about AI. It's because it is actually true AI. It's based on human brain processing function at its core. That's the IP that sits in the center of everything we do. But I do think you're absolutely right. You add AI to anything, and suddenly people go, "Oh, that's quite interesting," but only for this year. because by next year we'll have come up with something completely new, and I'm sure it'll be, some kind of, post-COVID sort of terminology, which I perish at the thought of what we might be talking about. But anyway, I'm sure, we continue to invent and reinvent and come up with terms and names for things. But, I think for us, we are genuine artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about sort of buzzwords and things. It seems to be one of two things. I think especially with AI or machine learning, people either think it's a total silver bullet, or they're like terrified of it, or I think they understand it and they get that, to your point, it's like an augmentation. But I've just seen, I think less with the term AI, just in general with the machine learning platforms or machine learning, people see it as a silver bullet. It's going to solve all our problems. It's going to do what. But I think what you guys do really brilliantly is articulate this idea that, it's giving you something you can't produce, but it's making you as a thinker, as a human, as a creative better. It's augmenting what you've already, been doing. And I think that's brilliant the way you guys talk about that.
Exactly right. And I think, that is a very important part of its sort of, fundamental role in a business. Is it kind of helps to understand instantly, what consumers see. So in a sense, it's not telling you what to do. It'll tell you whether what you're trying to do is happening. And if not, you can use it iteratively to, to refine that until you are making the things you want people to see, really, really salient and clear. And I think, that in itself is probably one of its greatest benefits, is that it augments. It's not a threat. So we used to talk about, the rate of artificial intelligence coming downstream was going to start replacing, up to 60% of, manual tasks, which would be a frightening impact on human employment ultimately, because if a human task can be replicated more effectively by AI, it will replace people. What will people do? But, ours is an augmentation. It's helping to ensure that the content you're producing is really, really effective and better than you could make it on your own. We might find, certainly with some creatives, is that they're very, very experienced. They really do understand how the human, consumer responds to certain things. So typically they will be in a good place already. But even there, it can help them to find just that little thing they might have missed, which could make all the difference.
Oh, totally. And what I found actually is a lot of times, you get experienced designers and their best practice, like they can't articulate it from a data point of view. They can't say, I tested blue against red and, blue won 80% of the time. So as a best practice, I use blue. That's not something they would say, but that's something that they've kind of learned. That's a terrible example, but you see my point. And I found that Dragonfly actually will help prove in a quantitative way that best practice 80 or 90% of the time is the right thing to do anyway. And it's sometimes just a matter of, and having been a client and, sat on the agency side of the table as well. I mean, clients deal with a lot. And, one of, I think, the frustrations and the joys of working as a marketing client is that a lot of stuff is subjective. And that's true. Like, oh, you get to be creative. You get to decide like A or B, which one of these creatives, do I find to be, the one that we should go with as a brand. But then you have to take that and you have to defend that to your boss, your boss's boss, legal, all these different places. And as a marketing client, you don't have, it's a client world. They speak numbers, they speak quantitative things, and creativity certainly plays a part. But if you have something in your tool belt that can help you make a data-driven argument about why blue is better than red or whatever, that helps everybody everywhere kind of take out, it doesn't take out the creativity, but it takes out some of the subjectivity, which I think is brilliant.
Totally. Yeah, and I think it was John Hegarty. It might have been at Cannes a few years back where he just said that data has no place in creativity, or words to that effect. And I just think that is crazy. It has absolutely a fundamental role to play in helping you to understand whether your creative is effective or not, in all manner of different applications, not just ours.
Yeah.
But I genuinely believe having been a marketer where effectively you have to use your own brain to take all of that information that sits around your world. I can remember sitting in front of these ghastly wave tracking reports for the army every quarter, 125 slides. And what I'd be trying to do is, from each of the kind of the insight pieces that came back from the research, is look at anything where there'd been a shift of more than 4% in a number, because those were our critical changes. You know,
Mm-hmm.
now what we're able to do is effectively, bring those sorts of, solutions to a more accessible level. So the nice thing about what we do now is you can train to use it in an hour. You can
Mm-hmm.
be making differences to your business's creative content output, the same day. It's that straightforward, and it doesn't take the brains of a data scientist to do it. You just have to have an intelligent marketer sit in front of it, and I think smart marketers will look at it and go, this is going to make a bit of a difference for me in my own career. I can make things happen differently. But, why wouldn't I do this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny you say, you don't have to be a data scientist or a cognitive scientist to
Yeah,
know how it works. I would always say, listen, this works and we know it works, but much, much smarter people than me have figured this out. Like
yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
just the dummy that's here like using it. Like they're brilliant, brilliant PhDs. You put this all together.
Yeah, and me too. And I would say, if I can use it, anyone can. Genuinely.
Yeah. That's how I feel too. Well, Mark, this has been like incredibly interesting and I really appreciate your time. At the end of all of our interviews, we do like to give the guests just a little bit of time if there's anything that you want to, we say shill, if you just want to share that, aside from Dragonfly, I just want to give you kind of the time to do that.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, it's been a really interesting conversation, Jen. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I've really enjoyed it. I mean, my reflection on the whole kind of quantum shift from a mainstream career into startup has been, it's been fantastic. We've done things that we just would never have done in a normal working environment. We've traveled the world. We've pitched in, I don't know, 5 or 6 major sort of international hubs. We've been roasted through investment panels and committees, and we kind of got there. So I suppose really my kind of my sharing moment would be, don't feel shy about doing it. Have a go. Life is too short to do things you don't enjoy. Get out, take that idea and turn it into something. In the last recession, I don't know, what did we get? We got Uber, we got Pinterest, we got Airbnb. Some of these phenomenal propositions came out of the doldrums of difficulty. And I think I certainly believe we will get back on our feet after this. Who knows when? Hopefully sooner rather than later. And there will have been innovation happening all over the place. It's just we haven't seen it yet because it's invisible yet. But when it starts to surface, I think we'll find there's a whole new generation of really exciting things happening. And if you have it within your gift to do so, be part of that. Be part of that evolution of new innovation. It's an exciting world out there.
Amazing. And very well said. I could not
Thank you.
agree more. Well, you did it. You've wasted another perfectly good half an hour or so with Rob and Jen and the Everybody Hates Your Brand podcast. Again, you can find us on everybodyhatesyourbrand.com and your podcast platform of choice. Have a week.
Take great care, division, and a belated Happy New Year.